With regards to the Mafia in the United States, the title Boss of Bosses is often attributed erroneously to various mobsters. However, in reality, only a handful of men have ever officially held this position. Let's check it out. Welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. Today, we're going to take a quick look at all of the mobsters who officially held the position of boss of bosses in the Mafia in America. Nicola Gentile was a long-time member of Cosa Nostra who travelled across the United States, often solving disputes. In 1963, he wrote a memoir of his life. In this book, he would state, "Between the heads of various borgata or families, they select the overall capo dei capi, boss of bosses, the king, which is the apex of the onorata societa." So, which mobsters in American Mafia history actually held this position? The first documented boss of bosses in the United States is believed to have been Jeppe Morello. Jeppe Morello was also known as Joseph Morello and Pete Morello. In addition, he is often called the clutch hand, due to deformity with one of his hands, as seen in this famous photo. And the United States Secret Service even labelled him One-Finger Jack. Morello was born in Sicily in 1867, and he was a suspect in the 1889 murder of Giovanni Vea. In 1894, he was sentenced to just over 6 years for counterfeiting, but by the time of his sentencing, it is believed that Jeppe Morello had fled Italy and moved to the United States. After arriving in New York, Jeppe Morello moved around the United States, first to Louisiana and then to Texas, before returning to New York in around 1897. By 1902, along with his close relatives, including his half-brother Ciro Terranova, Morello and his gang ran a violent crime group that specialised in counterfeiting. The Morello group grew in strength, and many murders were attributed to them, including the 1903 murder of Benedetto Madonia, who was tortured and then killed, and his body stuffed into a barrel. One newspaper would state, "Man in barrel was tortured then murdered." Investigation by the police shows that he was stabbed 20 times by his slayers before they finally ended his life by cutting his throat. Decoyed to the haunt of his slayers by woman's letter. Detectives believe he was the victim of a secret society, being led to this impression by the fact that the body was not concealed. Jeppe Morello was one of 12 men arrested in connection with this gruesome killing. He is seen in this mugshot on the bottom left with the name Morello spelt with the letter I instead of an O. Morello would eventually be sentenced to 25 years in prison for counterfeiting in 1910. He would serve 10 years after his sentence was commuted to 15 years in 1918. Jeppe Morello was released from prison in March 1920. So, what evidence do we have that Jeppe Morello was boss of bosses in the Mafia in the United States? Nicola Gentile, who we mentioned before, was inducted into Cosa Nostra in around 1906. He would write in his memoir, Vita di Capo Mafia, that Peter Morello, who had been the capo dei capi of the Onorata Societa since my induction, indicating that Jeppe Morello was indeed boss of bosses from at least 1906 until his incarceration in 1910. In addition, as covered by the excellent YouTube channel The Mob Archaeologists, Jeppe Morello wrote a letter to a Chicago gangster by the name of Rosario Dispenza, informing Dispenza that he had no place attending the Mafia's Grand Council meetings. The letter states, "Dear friend, in answer to your letter that bears the date of the 10th, I hear what you say in it. Regarding the council, you have no right to be present in the meetings. The council is divided and separated from the assembly. But in case that some councilman wishes to be present in some meeting of the assembly, he can come but only to hear, and then has no right to the floor, neither right to an opinion or right to vote. Have I explained myself? Clearly indicating the authority that Giuseppe Morello had over other cities, such as Chicago. In another letter from Giuseppe Morello, this time to New Orleans boss Vincenzo Merici, Morello is advising Merici to reorganize his crime group by getting rid of anyone who isn't worthy of being a member. The letter reads, "Dear friend, I'm in possession of your 2 letters, one that bears the date of the 5th, the other on the 10th of November. I understand the contents. In regard to being able to reorganize the family, for me, I advise you all to do it, because it seems it is not just to stay without a king nor country. But I authorize you to convey to all my humble prayer and my weak opinion, but well understood, that those that are worthy and those that wish to belong, those that do not wish to belong, let them go." A further indication of Morello's standing in the United States at this time. Again, I advise you all to check out the superb Mob Archaeologist channel for a brilliant analysis of these 2 letters and other mob history. After being released from prison in 1920, Morello would eventually serve as an advisor to another powerful mobster, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria. Morello would be gunned down in his office in 1930, a victim of the so-called Castellano War. After Giuseppe Morello was imprisoned in 1910, the next boss of bosses in the Mafia in America was Salvatore "Toto Daila. Toto Daila was born in Palermo, Sicily in November 1877. He travelled to the United States in 1906 at the age of 29, and in around 5 years had assumed such status and power in the underworld that he was elected by the Mafia's General Assembly to be boss of bosses, sometime after Giuseppe Morello's incarceration. Daila was the boss of what is now known as the Gambino crime family. Throughout the early years of his reign as boss of his own family and boss of bosses, Toto Daila frequently had to thwart attempts to dethrone him from the remaining members of the Morello organization. And between 1913 and 1915, there were several murders on each side in this conflict. Nicola Gentile would talk of how in the 1920s Salvatore Daila wielded his power. A General Assembly of Cosa Nostra bosses was called after California boss Vito Genovese accused 3 men of the Kansas City Mafia of killing men that were under his protection. At the time, Nicola Gentile was the alleged leader of Cosa Nostra in Kansas City. At this General Assembly, a trial was held. Gentile would discuss this Mafia trial with an Italian journalist in September 1963. The published article states, "The assembly was called by the Chief of Chiefs, who at the time was still Toto Daila. What does the term assembly mean? Who are the people who were called to attend the assembly? A General Assembly was called. That means a gathering of all the representatives in the United States. How many people attended the New York trial? Gentile is lost in thought. Old faces hurry in front of his mind's eye. Old words ring in his mind's ear. There were many of us there. All of us, heads of families, had taken along our assistants and advisors. In addition, we all had a bodyguard. Then, of course, the local people were there. They had come en masse to lend their support to the prosecutor, who was DiGiorgio, who had managed to influence the Chief of Chiefs in his favour before the trial. How many attended the assembly? Too many, some 150 people. What language did you speak? Our language, Sicilian. There were 150 people attending that assembly, and all of them were ready to vote for a death sentence. Did you have depositions like in a regular trial? Were cross-examinations allowed? Theoretically, depositions and cross-examinations in the proper form were allowed. Actually, the Chief of Chiefs called the shots. In the last analysis, These assemblies brought together a bunch of illiterate, ignorant people, incapable of following the logics of an argument, devoid of any personality. Didn't you say that the chiefs, assistant chiefs, and advisors of the mafia were in attendance? Gentile keeps quiet a few minutes, as though lost in reflection over his thoughts. Then slowly he explains. In their towns, or in their sections of town, they may be somebody. They wield some power. But in New York, in front of Toto Daila, they were nobody. The prosecutor would say death, Daila would nod, and they were all ready to vote for a death sentence. Are the sentences voted upon by the entire assembly? No. After the assembly is adjourned, a closed-door session is held, which is called the General Council of the Heads of Families. Naturally, the prosecutor does not attend. Resuming his story, Gentile says, in the council, the Chief of Chiefs was the first to have the floor. He summed up what had taken place in the assembly. Was Toto Daila literate? He had a certain amount of education. He was a skillful man, but his true power lay in his cruelty. On that day in New York, the question before the council was the life and death question for 3 men. After listening to Toto Daila sum up the case with a strong bias for a death sentence, Gentile stood up to deliver his defense plea. Salvatore Toto Daila's long reign of around 18 years as boss of bosses was ended when he was gunned down in October 1928. There are many videos regarding the next boss of bosses, Joe Masseria, so I won't go into too much detail on his early life. Giuseppe Masseria was born in Sicily in January 1886 and came to the United States in 1902. David Critchley writes about Masseria's early criminal career in his excellent book, The Origin of Organized Crime in America. The book states, his first criminal undertakings included an alleged foray into the Black Hand and kidnapping. For almost 18 months, Masseria led a burglary gang robbing stores in the Bowery until he was caught in 1913 while trying to break through the rear wall of a pawn shop. It was in the 1920s, after his release from prison, when Joe Masseria rose to power during Prohibition. His criminal gang gobbled up smaller alcohol organizations. And many believe he was behind the murder of boss of bosses Salvatore Daila in 1928. With Daila dead, Joe Masseria emerged as the most powerful mobster in New York. One FBI file states, NYT2 advised that Joe Masseria was capo of a New York family and was also capo dei capi after Toto Daila had been killed on his orders. It is clear from this that the General Assembly elected Masseria to the position of boss of bosses in around late 1928 after Daila's death. However, after 2 years in this position, the General Assembly removed Masseria from the role of boss of bosses. In part due to the ongoing violence in the so-called Castellano War and Masseria's battles with rival boss Salvatore Maranzano. In late 1930, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria was replaced as boss of bosses on a provisional basis by Gaspare Messina, the head of Cosa Nostra in Boston, Massachusetts. One FBI file states, during December 1930, the Rappresentante of Onorata Societa convened an assembly in Boston, Massachusetts, at which Gaspare Messina was provisionally elected capo dei capi. As is well known, Joe Masseria was murdered in April 1931, and Salvatore Maranzano was then elected to the position of boss of bosses, replacing Gaspare Messina. But before we take a quick look at Salvatore Maranzano, there is another name that appears in an FBI file, based on Gentile's accounts, that is potentially considered to have been elected boss of bosses after Gaspare Messina and before Salvatore Maranzano. His name was Vincenzo Troya. The FBI file lists the boss of bosses as follows: Pidu Joseph Morello, Toto Salvatore d'Aquila, Joe Giuseppe Masseria, Gaspare Messina, Vincenzo Troya, who, although selected, didn't serve, but was replaced by Salvatore Maranzano. Vincenzo Troya was a respected member of Cosa Nostra, and it is alleged that back in Sicily he had been the boss of San Giuseppe Lato. This theory about Troya being elected boss of bosses can be seen in the following FBI file, based on Nicola Gentile's accounts. At the meeting in Chicago, some rappresentante recalling the evils of Masseria's dictatorial rule as capo dei capi, proposed a commission of 6 members to rule as capi di capi. Vincenzo Troya was selected to form this commission. In my opinion, this information does not confirm Vincenzo Troya as boss of bosses. However, he was selected as the man to form a commission who would rule as joint boss of bosses. This meeting in Chicago followed the murder of Joe Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano was vying to become boss of bosses. Maranzano quickly moved against this idea of a commission of ruling bosses, as seen in the following FBI file. Maranzano plotted against the idea and the selection of Troya, resulting in his own designation by the members as capo di capi. Salvatore Maranzano was himself famously murdered in September 1931 in a plot architected by Charlie Luciano, and the official title of Boss of Bosses was scrapped for good. Nicola Gentile would state that another General Assembly of Mobsters was held. The FBI file states, "At this assembly it was decided to replace the Capo dei Capi with a Commissione composed of 6 persons to govern the destiny of all the mafia of the United States." Interestingly, various sources debate the number of men who made up this new commission, but regardless, the role of boss of bosses was no longer. Over the years, however, the media and press continued to refer to various mobsters as boss of bosses, perhaps loving the idea of one all-powerful gangster controlling organised crime. The likes of Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, Vincent Gigante, and John Gotti have all erroneously been labelled as boss of bosses. But in reality, this was never the case. That position has never existed after 1931. Interestingly, however, in 1967, an FBI informant stated that there was a plan by Vito Genovese and Joseph Bonanno back in 1957 to remove the commission and bring back the role of boss of bosses. The FBI file states, "It had always been Genovese's objective to abolish the commission and return the control of La Cosa Nostra to a capo di capi, boss of bosses. Genovese has always wanted to be capo di capi, and had selected Joe Bonanno as his number 1 man. Bonanno had been part of the conspiracy, inasmuch as the arrangement between them was that Bonanno would succeed Genovese upon Genovese's death or retirement. He said that Genovese and Bonanno have, for many years, conspired towards the objective of first uniting all 5 New York families, and thereafter control the other LCN families throughout the United States. Whether this is true, who knows, but makes for fascinating reading. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.